Have you ever wondered what dark secrets lie buried beneath the sprawling plantations of the Old South? What unspeakable rituals and twisted practices were hidden behind the grand white columns and manicured gardens? Tonight, I invite you to uncover one of the most disturbing chapters in American history that few textbooks dare to mention. Before we begin this harrowing journey together, I'd like to ask you to share in the comments where you're watching from. This channel survives only through your support, and we need your help to continue bringing these hidden historical horrors to light. Please subscribe if you haven't already, as we depend on your support to uncover more of these forgotten atrocities. In the scorching summer of 1861, as the first shots of the Civil War echoed across a divided nation, a far more insidious horror was unfolding on the Blackthorn Plantation in eastern Texas. Located just outside the small township of Crescent Falls, the 1,200-acre estate was owned by the prominent Hargrove family, whose fortune had been built on cotton, sugarcane, and the broken backs of over 200 enslaved individuals. The plantation's grand house sat atop a gentle rise, its white columns gleaming in the merciless Texas sun like the bleached bones of some ancient beast. From this vantage point, Eliza Hargrove, the so-called Mistress of Blackthorn, could survey her domain with cold, calculating eyes. Her husband, Colonel Richard Hargrove, had departed with the Confederate forces 3 months prior, leaving his 32-year-old wife to manage the estate's affairs, a responsibility she embraced with disturbing enthusiasm. Eliza was not like other plantation mistresses of her time. She did not view herself as merely the lady of the house, tasked with overseeing domestic matters. No, Eliza Hargrove considered herself an architect of human affairs, particularly those of the enslaved people she viewed as her personal property. She kept meticulous records of their lives in leather-bound ledgers that never left her side: births, deaths, punishments, and most unusually, what she called selective pairings. "The breeding of superior stock requires careful management," she wrote in her personal journal, recovered decades later from a hidden compartment in her writing desk. Just as one wouldn't allow prize horses to mate indiscriminately, the same principles must be applied to ensure the strongest, most valuable servants for future generations. "It is not merely good business, it is my sacred duty to improve upon nature's occasional mistakes." The first signs that something particularly sinister was occurring at Blackthorn came to light through the testimony of Jeremiah Wells, a traveling Bible salesman who had the misfortune of seeking shelter at the plantation during a violent thunderstorm in late July of 1861. "I was received by Mrs. Hargrove with a hospitality that at first seemed entirely proper," Wells later recounted in a sworn affidavit to Union officials in 1865. "Yet there was something in her manner that disquieted me from the start, a certain clinical detachment in her eyes, as though she were constantly evaluating and measuring those around her against some private standard." Wells was invited to stay for dinner, and subsequently offered a guest room for the night, as the storm showed no signs of abating. During the meal, he recalled Eliza speaking at length about her innovative management techniques and how she had increased the plantation's human assets by nearly 15% in the 3 years since implementing what she cryptically referred to as her pairing ceremonies. "She spoke of people as though discussing livestock," Wells wrote. "When I expressed mild curiosity about these ceremonies, thinking perhaps she referred to some Christian ritual she had instituted among the slaves, her explanation chilled me to the bone." According to Wells, Eliza described with pride a system she had developed for arranging marriages among the enslaved population, not based on their own choices or affections, but according to what she called desirable physical and temperamental traits. More disturbing still was her revelation that she had commissioned special rings for these forced unions, cast from bronze and stamped with the Blackthorn seal, a thorny branch entwined around the letters BT. "These rings are not mere trinkets," she reportedly told Wells. "They are binding contracts, physical reminders that their unions and any offspring they produce belong to Blackthorn. The bronze will tarnish their skin over time, leaving the seal's imprint like a brand." Rather poetic, don't you think? What Wells did not know, what would not come to light until much later, was that the bronze for these rings had been sourced from a far more macabre origin than Eliza had revealed. The following morning, as Wells prepared to depart, he witnessed something that would haunt him for the remainder of his days. From his second-floor window, he observed Eliza in the garden behind the main house, standing before a group of about 20 enslaved men and women arranged in pairs. She wore a dress of deep crimson, unusual for a morning gathering, and around her neck hung what appeared to be an oversized version of the bronze seal ring, gleaming dully in the early sunlight. "She moved from pair to pair," Wells wrote, placing rings on their fingers with a ceremony that mockingly imitated Christian marriage rites. Yet it was the expression on her face that struck me most forcibly, not the benevolent smile of a woman blessing a sacred union, but the satisfied look of a farmer who has successfully yoked together two prized oxen. Wells left Blackthorn that morning, deeply disturbed but unsure what, if anything, he could or should do about what he had witnessed. It was, after all, 1861 in Confederate Texas, where the practice of slavery itself was not only legal but vigorously defended. The particular cruelties of individual slave owners rarely invited intervention, so long as they maintained a veneer of Christian propriety. It would be nearly 4 years before Wells would have an opportunity to report what he had seen, by which time far more disturbing details about Eliza Hargrove and Blackthorn Plantation had begun to emerge. The first comprehensive account of the horrors at Blackthorn came from Abigail Freeman, a formerly enslaved woman who escaped the plantation in the chaotic final months of the Civil War. After reaching Union lines, Freeman provided testimony that expanded on Wells's observations and revealed the true extent of Eliza's monstrous breeding program. Miss Eliza wasn't interested in love or even basic human dignity, Freeman stated in her recorded testimony preserved in the National Archives. "She studied us like we was specimens, measured our arms, legs, checked our teeth, had us lift heavy things to test our strength, kept notes on which women birthed easy and which men worked longest without tiring. Then she'd decide who was to be paired." According to Freeman, refusing one of Eliza's arranged pairings was not an option. Those who resisted faced severe punishment, including confinement in what the enslaved people called the waiting room, a small, windowless outbuilding where individuals would be kept in isolation, often for weeks, until they agreed to the pairing. "There was nothing but a dirt floor, a bucket and darkness in that place," Freeman recounted. "People came out different, broken, ready to do whatever she asked just to never go back there." But the bronze rings themselves harbored an even darker secret, one that Eliza had shared only with her most trusted house servant Nathaniel, who later confirmed Freeman's account. "The mistress had a special place behind the tool shed," Nathaniel testified, "a furnace and some molds. But what went into that furnace?" His voice reportedly faltered here. "She used the belongings of the dead. Metal buttons from their clothes, buckles from their shoes, said it bound their service to Blackthorn even after death. But sometimes, when metal was scarce, she'd use other things, personal items, even teeth." Historical records confirm that dental gold was indeed sometimes used during this period, extracted from deceased enslaved individuals who had gold fillings or dental work. A rare but documented practice among the wealthiest enslaved people who had specialized skills and were occasionally permitted to keep small amounts of money they earned through extra work. A journal entry from Eliza, dated September 3, 1861, appears to reference this practice. "Harvested materials from the 3 lost in last month's fever. Disappointingly little yield, though Daniel provided several excellent specimens from his dental work. His contribution will bind at least 2 new pairs to Blackthorn's legacy. By October of 1861, Eliza's pairing ceremonies had taken on an increasingly ritualistic character. No longer content to simply arrange these forced unions, she began to incorporate elements that witnesses would later describe as occult and blasphemous. She made them drink something from a silver cup before exchanging the rings, Abigail Freeman recalled. Something dark that smelled of herbs and copper, said it was to ensure fertility, but more than one woman took sick afterward. Had terrible dreams, they said. Dreams of children born with the Blackthorn seal already marked on their skin. Analysis of a preserved sample of this fertility tonic, discovered in a hidden compartment of Eliza's writing desk alongside her journals, revealed a disturbing concoction of herbs known to affect the reproductive system, including tansy, pennyroyal, and cottonroot, plants traditionally used both to promote and prevent conception, depending on the dosage. More alarming was the presence of trace amounts of human blood and bone ash. By mid-November, as the first winter chill descended upon eastern Texas, rumors of Eliza's disturbing practices had begun to circulate even among the neighboring plantations. Most dismissed these stories as the fanciful imaginings of superstitious slaves. A few, however, took note of the unusually high birth rate at Blackthorn over the previous 2 years, and the troubling fact that infant mortality on the plantation had dropped to near zero despite the harsh conditions. Not a single stillbirth in 23 months, wrote Dr. Thomas Merrick, who attended births at several plantations in the region, in a letter to a colleague in Houston. In my 30 years of practice, I have never witnessed such a statistic, particularly among the slave population, where poor nutrition and overwork typically result in numerous complications. When I remarked upon this to Mrs. Hargrove, she merely smiled and attributed it to her superior management techniques. I confess there is something in that woman's demeanor that increasingly disturbs me. Dr. Merrick's unease would prove well-founded. In early December, he was summoned urgently to Blackthorn to attend to one of Eliza's paired women who had gone into labor several weeks prematurely. What he witnessed that night would lead him to break his long silence about the plantation's disturbing practices. I arrived after sundown to find the woman, Ruth was her name, in tremendous distress, Merrick later testified. Not merely the expected pains of childbirth, but a state of terror such as I have rarely encountered. She clutched at my hands, begging me to take it out and not let it mark any more of us. The birth itself proceeded with unusual difficulty, despite Ruth being a young, otherwise healthy woman who had delivered 2 previous children without complication. When the infant finally emerged, Dr. Merrick observed something that defied his medical understanding. The child bore a distinct discoloration on its left shoulder, he wrote. Not a natural birthmark, but a clearly defined pattern that, to my astonishment, formed the unmistakable shape of the Blackthorn seal. The thorny branch and letters I had seen impressed upon documents in Eliza's study. When I turned to remark upon this extraordinary phenomenon, I found Mrs. Hargrove watching from the doorway, an expression of triumph upon her face. What happened next remains a matter of historical debate. According to Merrick's account, Eliza approached the newborn, produced a small vial of dark liquid from her pocket, and attempted to place a drop on the infant's lips before he could intervene. In the ensuing struggle, the vial shattered, spilling its contents across the birthing room floor. The liquid hissed and bubbled upon contact with the wooden planks, Merrick claimed, eating into them like the strongest acid. The smell that arose was unutterably foul, the stench of corruption and decay. I gathered the child and mother and fled that room, that house, that accursed plantation, before Mrs. Hargrove could recover her composure. Merrick took Ruth and her infant to his own home that night, later helping them escape north with the assistance of local abolitionists. His written account of the events at Blackthorn, sent to both medical colleagues and union sympathizers, would eventually reach federal authorities, though not before Eliza's experiments had progressed to an even more terrible phase. By January of 1862, Colonel Richard Hargrove had been killed in battle, leaving Eliza with complete and unfettered control of Blackthorn. Free from even the nominal oversight her husband had occasionally exercised, she expanded her breeding program and began conducting what she termed generational studies. A recovered page from her journal, dated January 20th, 1862, reveals the truly horrific nature of these studies. The first generation of Blackthorn pairings has proven remarkably successful. Survival rates exceed all expectations, and each child bears the mark, though with varying degrees of prominence. Most interesting are the behavioral traits: heightened obedience, reduced resistance to authority, and accelerated physical development. The time has come to begin cross-generational pairings, to concentrate the bloodlines further. This chilling entry suggests that Eliza had begun arranging for the oldest children from her first pairings, some as young as 13 or 14, to be paired with adults from her original program, creating an increasingly tangled web of forced relationships designed to produce what she called the perfect servant. By February, strange incidents began to plague Blackthorn Plantation. Livestock died unexpectedly, crops withered in otherwise fertile fields, and a series of inexplicable fires erupted in various outbuildings. Most disturbing were the reports from the enslaved population of seeing shadow figures moving through the fields at night, always heading toward the main house before disappearing. "Wasn't ghosts like you'd think of," Samuel Porter, another formerly enslaved man from Blackthorn, later recounted. "These shadows had substance to them, left footprints in the mud, and they all had the same mark. Right where they should have had faces, there was just that Blackthorn seal glowing faintly like hot metal." Eliza herself appeared increasingly haggard and paranoid during this period, according to accounts from those who encountered her on her increasingly rare visits to Crescent Falls. She was observed purchasing large quantities of salt, iron nails, and red clay, items commonly associated with folk magic practices designed to ward off evil spirits. A letter she wrote to a former classmate in March reveals her deteriorating mental state. "Something has gone awry with my great work. The rings no longer simply bind them to Blackthorn. They have begun to bind something else to us. I see them watching from the corners of rooms, from the shadows between the cotton rows. Always watching, waiting. The marks appear now without the rings, children born with the seal already upon them, even to mothers who have not been part of the program. It spreads like contagion." By early April, reports suggest that nearly every child born at Blackthorn, regardless of whether their parents wore the bronze rings, came into the world bearing some variation of the plantation's seal somewhere on their body. More alarming were accounts that these birthmarks would occasionally shift position or change shape slightly, always becoming more defined, more precisely matched to the original seal Eliza had designed. The situation reached a breaking point on April 28, 1862, when a passing Confederate patrol was summoned to Blackthorn by a hysterical overseer claiming that Eliza had gone mad and barricaded herself in the main house after setting fire to the slave quarters. What the soldiers discovered upon their arrival has been pieced together from their official report and subsequent testimonies. The slave quarters had indeed been burned, though evidence suggested this was no ordinary fire. The wood was charred in distinct patterns that formed repeatedly the now familiar Blackthorn seal. More disturbing was the discovery of dozens of the bronze rings arranged in concentric circles in the central yard, each embedded in the earth as though pressed there with tremendous force. Of the 237 enslaved people who had lived and worked at Blackthorn, only 63 remained on the property. The rest had fled or vanished in the chaos. Those who remained were found huddled in the fields, many of them wearing multiple bronze rings on their fingers, wrists, and even threaded through their ears and lips. All bore the mark of the blackthorn seal somewhere on their bodies, and all refused to speak, except to repeat the same phrase, "She has called them back and they are hungry." The main house itself presented the most disturbing scene. The doors and windows had been sealed not from the inside, as the overseer had claimed, but from the outside, nailed shut and reinforced with heavy furniture dragged from around the property. According to Lieutenant James Walsh, who led the patrol, it took his men over an hour to force entry into the building. The interior was dark as pitch despite the midday sun outside, Walsh reported. Lanterns would not stay lit beyond the threshold. We were forced to proceed by touch alone, calling for Mrs. Hargrove as we searched room by room. The air was thick with the scent of copper and decay, and underfoot the floorboards seemed to shift and pulse as though alive. In Eliza's study, the patrol made a series of grim discoveries. Her journals lay open on her desk, the final entries written in what appeared to be blood rather than ink. The walls were covered with hundreds of copies of the blackthorn seal, drawn in various substances: ink, paint, blood, and ash. Most disturbing was a large map of the plantation pinned to one wall, with small bronze rings marking various locations throughout the property. Each ring on the map corresponded to a burial site, clarified Nathaniel, the house servant who had assisted in the investigation. Places where slaves had died over the years, worked to death in the fields, beaten for disobedience, succumbed to illness or childbirth. Mrs. Hargrove had marked them all, kept records of each death. Said their service to Blackthorn didn't end when they died. Of Eliza herself, the patrol found no trace, at least not initially. It was only when they descended to the cellar that they discovered the final horror of Blackthorn Plantation. The cellar had been transformed into what Walsh described as a workshop of abomination. A large furnace dominated the center of the space, surrounded by molds for casting the bronze rings. Shelves lined the walls, holding hundreds of labeled jars containing human teeth, bone fragments, locks of hair, and other personal effects of the deceased. A large leather-bound ledger nearby contained precise records of which materials had been used in each batch of rings. At the rear of the cellar, behind the furnace, the patrol discovered a hidden door leading to a small circular chamber. Inside, seated on a chair of twisted branches, they found what remained of Eliza Hargrove. She was still alive after a fashion, Walsh wrote in his report, clearly struggling to articulate what he had witnessed. Her skin had darkened to the same dull bronze as the rings and appeared to have hardened similarly. Most disturbing were her eyes, which remained animate and aware, while the rest of her had transformed into this metallic state. According to Walsh, Eliza was still capable of speech, though her voice had acquired a hollow, resonant quality, as though coming from within a metal container. What she said to the patrol would be recorded, and then subsequently redacted from official reports, deemed too disturbing for public record. However, Nathaniel, who was present, later revealed her. Words, "I sought to bind them to this land forever," she allegedly told the soldiers. The blackthorn seal was visible across every inch of exposed flesh, repeating in an endless pattern, to create the perfect servants who would never flee, never resist, never die. I succeeded beyond imagining. They serve still, but no longer me. They have returned with a new purpose, to claim what was built upon their broken bodies. The rings were keys, opening doors that cannot now be closed. They come now not as slaves, but as collectors, and all of Blackthorn is their due. The patrol removed Eliza from the plantation that day, transporting her to a military hospital in Houston, where, according to heavily redacted medical records, she was placed under observation. 3 days later, hospital staff discovered her room empty, the bronze cast of her body left behind, hollow and split open like a discarded chrysalis. The fate of Blackthorn Plantation itself is well documented. Despite multiple attempts to resell the property after the war, it remained mysteriously uncultivable. Crops planted there would grow initially, then wither and die just before harvest, the withered plants forming distinct patterns when viewed from above, always variations of the now infamous blackthorn seal. The main house burned to the ground in 1870, a fire that witnesses claimed moved with purposeful intelligence, consuming only the house while leaving surrounding structures untouched. Most peculiar was the testimony that the flames themselves formed the shape of a thorny branch as they reduced the mansion to ash. Today, the former blackthorn plantation lies abandoned, its once fertile fields overrun with thick brambles that local residents claim bear unusual bronze-colored thorns. The land has never been successfully developed, despite numerous attempts over the years. Those who have tried report equipment failures, unexplained illnesses, and disturbing dreams of dark figures wearing bronze rings, moving silently through endless rows of cotton. Perhaps most unsettling are the periodic reports from nearby Crescent Falls of children born with unusual birthmarks, faint discolorations that, if viewed in the right light, resemble a thorny branch entwined around the letters BT. Local doctors dismiss these marks as ordinary birthmarks, whose significance has been exaggerated by superstitious individuals familiar with the Blackthorn legend. Yet the descendants of those who escaped Blackthorn know better. They keep their own records, tracking the spread of the mark through generations and across state lines. They recognize one another by the distinct discoloration they all share. Not a mark of enslavement anymore, but a bond of survival and vigilance. "We watch for her return," said Eleanor James, a direct descendant of Abigail Freeman, in a rare interview given in 1972. "The mark reminds us that some debts can never be paid, some wounds never heal. Eliza Hargrove sought to bind our ancestors to that cursed land forever. Instead, she bound herself to us, to our memory, our vigilance, our justice. The bronze may tarnish, but the seal remains." In 2003, during construction of a highway that would have cut through a portion of the former Blackthorn property, workers uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of at least 40 individuals. Archaeological analysis confirmed these were enslaved people who had died in the mid-19th century. Most disturbing was the discovery that many of the skeletons showed evidence of post-mortem disturbance, specifically the removal of teeth, small bones, and metal objects like buttons and buckles. And, more chilling still, each skull bore a small, precise indentation in the exact same location, a depression in the shape of the Blackthorn seal, as though it had been pressed into the bone with tremendous force. Forensic experts were unable to determine whether these marks were created before or after death. Construction of the highway was abandoned shortly thereafter, following a series of equipment malfunctions, unexplained accidents, and the abrupt resignation of several key engineers who refused to cite their reasons for leaving the project. To this day, the former Blackthorn plantation remains undeveloped, a 1,200-acre scar on the Texas landscape that locals avoid, particularly after sundown. Occasionally, travelers on nearby roads report glimpsing figures moving through the overgrown fields, figures that, when approached, dissolve into nothing but the gleam of metal catching the last rays of daylight. And sometimes, on particularly still nights, residents of Crescent Falls report hearing the distant sound of metal striking metal, like dozens of bronze rings tapping rhythmically against each other, calling to something in the darkness. The sound is always strongest from the direction of the old plantation, but seems to echo from everywhere at once, as though the very earth remembers what was done there and waits. The legacy of Eliza Hargrove and her ghastly plot continues to cast its shadow across generations, a stark reminder that some horrors leave marks that can never be erased, only passed down, remembered, and vigilantly watched for signs of return. For the true terror of Blackthorn was never just what happened within its borders, but how its influence continues to spread, ring by ring, mark by mark, binding past to present in chains stronger than bronze. The story of Blackthorn Plantation might seem like a relic of the distant past, an aberration consigned to history's darkest chapters. But what if I told you that Eliza Hargrove's terrible legacy continues to this day, flowing through bloodlines across America like a bronze taint that refuses to fade? In October of 2017, Clara Wilson, a graduate student researching her family history at the University of Texas, made a discovery that would connect her directly to the horrors of Blackthorn. While digitizing county records from eastern Texas, she found a faded registry containing the names of the enslaved people who had lived and died on the Hargrove estate. "I almost closed the file," Wilson later recounted in a series of anonymous online posts. "But then I saw a name I recognized, Margaret Wilson, my great-great-great-grandmother. According to the registry, she had been paired with a man named Samuel and had given birth to 3 children at Blackthorn before escaping north during the Civil War. Further investigation revealed that Margaret had been one of the recipients of Eliza's bronze rings, forced into a union that Eliza had personally selected based on her disturbing eugenic criteria. More disturbing still was Clara's discovery that she herself bore a small branch-like birthmark on her left shoulder blade, a mark that, according to family stories, had appeared on at least one child in every generation since Margaret's escape. "I always thought it was just a quirky, hereditary birthmark," Clara wrote. "Now I understand why my grandmother would make the sign of the cross whenever she saw it during my childhood. She knew what it meant." Clara's research led her to contact other descendants of Blackthorn survivors, creating an informal network of individuals connected by both blood and the lingering shadow of Eliza Hargrove's experiments. What emerged from their collected testimonies was a pattern more disturbing than any one of them had suspected. "We all have the dreams," wrote Michael Taylor, another descendant whose ancestor had been forced to work in Eliza's ring-casting workshop. "Dreams of walking through cotton fields at night, following figures wearing bronze masks. They always lead to a great pit in the earth, filled with molten metal that bubbles and forms faces before dissolving again." Even more alarming were the reports of strange phenomena that seemed to follow the descendants, particularly those who, like Clara, bore variations of the Blackthorn birthmark. Electronic devices malfunctioning in their presence, unexplained knocking sounds at night, mirrors that showed brief reflections of figures standing behind them, figures wearing outdated clothing and bronze rings on every finger. In December of 2018, 5 descendants, including Clara, decided to confront the source of their shared nightmares. Against the warnings of local residents, they traveled to the remains of Blackthorn Plantation, now an overgrown wilderness of brambles and twisted oak trees, to perform what Clara called a ritual of severance, an attempt to break whatever supernatural bond still connected them to Eliza Hargrove and her terrible legacy. What happened during their night at Blackthorn was documented only in a series of increasingly frantic text messages Clara sent to her academic advisor, messages that abruptly ceased just after midnight. The group was reported missing 3 days later, when none of them returned to their homes or contacted family members. A search of the Blackthorn property by local authorities found no trace of the 5 researchers, though one deputy reported finding dozens of small bronze rings scattered around a clearing, arranged in some kind of pattern. By the time additional officers arrived to document the scene, the rings had vanished, leaving only circular impressions in the soil. 2 weeks after their disappearance, each of the 5 missing persons was found safely returned to their respective homes, with no memory of where they had been or how they had gotten back. Medical examinations revealed nothing unusual except for one shared characteristic. Each now bore an additional birthmark, identical to their original Blackthorn mark, but located on the opposite side of their body, creating a perfect symmetry. None of the five would speak about their experience at Blackthorn, claiming complete amnesia regarding the events of that night and the subsequent 2 weeks. However, Clara Wilson's academic advisor reported receiving one final email from her account a month later, containing only a single line. "She found a way back through our blood, but we found something too. The rings bind both ways." In the years since this incident, unusual reports have emerged from across the country, particularly in areas where descendants of Blackthorn's enslaved population settled after emancipation. Stories of bronze rings found buried in gardens and fields, always arranged in perfect circles. Accounts of strange birthmarks appearing overnight on newborn children, marks that seem to shift and change position when not directly observed. Most disturbing are the periodic sightings of a woman in 19th century dress, her skin bearing an unmistakable metallic sheen, standing motionless outside homes belonging to Blackthorn descendants. Witnesses describe her expression as hungry and calculating, her eyes constantly moving as though assessing the occupants through windows and walls. These sightings reached a peak in February of 2023, when no fewer than 17 separate Blackthorn descendants across 7 states reported seeing the woman on the same night. In each case, she was observed holding what appeared to be a leather-bound ledger and a small cloth bag that clinked metallically when she moved. Then, as suddenly as they had begun, the sightings ceased. The descendants' network fell silent, their online forums abandoned mid-conversation. Attempts by paranormal researchers to contact known Blackthorn descendants have been met with polite but firm refusals, or claims that they have no knowledge of any connection to the infamous plantation. Public records indicate that many of these descendants have relocated without leaving forwarding addresses, their homes sold quickly and often at prices well below market value. Those few who remain in their original communities display a striking change in behavior, becoming reclusive, avoiding direct eye contact, and wearing long sleeves and high collars regardless of the weather, as though concealing something on their skin. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery made by construction workers renovating the Crescent Falls Historical Society building in June of 2024. Hidden within a sealed wall space, they found a small bronze box containing a single sheet of paper and 23 bronze rings of various sizes. The paper, dated April 28, 2023, exactly 161 years to the day after Eliza Hargrove's disappearance, contained just 3 lines of text in an elegant, antiquated hand. The collection is complete. The ledger is balanced. Blackthorn's legacy returns to Blackthorn's earth. The rings and document were secured as historical artifacts pending authentication. However, before experts could examine them, the bronze box and its contents vanished from the Society's locked storage room. Security footage showed nothing except a momentary shadow passing across the camera lens at 3:17 in the morning. A shadow that, when the footage was enhanced, appeared to form the unmistakable pattern of a thorny branch entwined around the letters BT. To this day, the former Blackthorn plantation remains abandoned, a place avoided by locals and unknown to most visitors. Yet satellite imagery reveals something peculiar, what appears to be a series of perfect circles pressed into the overgrown fields, visible only from above. These circles appear and disappear seasonally, as though something beneath the soil periodically rises close to the surface before retreating once again. Wildlife cameras placed on the property's perimeter by environmental researchers have occasionally captured images of what they describe as organized movement among the brambles at night, patterns of shifting vegetation that suggest multiple figures moving in coordinated formation, though no actual individuals can be seen. More recently, residents of Crescent Falls have reported hearing a sound like distant singing coming from the direction of Blackthorn on still nights. Voices raised in what one witness described as a hymn without hope, accompanied by a rhythmic clinking, as of many small metal objects striking against one another. The true nature of what transpired at Blackthorn Plantation in 1861, and what continues there today, may never be fully understood. Perhaps Eliza Hargrove's twisted experiment in human bondage created something that transcended physical chains, a legacy of spiritual enslavement that continues to claim victims across generations. Or perhaps the truth is even darker, that those who were most deeply wronged have found a way to turn Eliza's own tools against her, binding her restless spirit to an eternal purgatory of her own making, forced to wander between worlds, forever seeking to complete a collection that can never be finished. What remains certain is that the bronze rings of Blackthorn continue to surface periodically across America, usually in areas with historical connections to Texas, or to families who fled north during the Civil War. Antique dealers report that such rings, when discovered, often sell quickly to anonymous buyers, despite their macabre history, or perhaps because of it. Those who study the paranormal suggest that these rings may serve as anchors, tethering something ancient and hungry to our world. They advise that anyone discovering such an item, a small bronze ring bearing the seal of a thorny branch around the letters BT, should not handle it directly, but instead bury it in salted earth at a crossroads, preferably at midnight during a waning moon. The final word on this disturbing chapter of American history perhaps belongs to Eleanor James, the descendant of Blackthorn survivor Abigail Freeman, who warned in her 1972 interview, "The rings were never just jewelry. They were contracts written in bronze and blood, binding past to future, the living to the dead. Such contracts cannot be broken by time alone. They must be answered, honored, or transformed. Until then, Blackthorn's mistress and her collected souls will never truly rest." As night falls across Texas and the rest of America, there are those who still check their children for unusual birthmarks, who hang iron horseshoes above their doors, who avoid wearing metal rings of any kind. They are the ones who remember, who understand that some horrors do not end with death, and some bonds once forged can never truly be broken. For the legacy of Blackthorn Plantation and Eliza Hargrove's ghastly breeding program lives on in bloodlines and birthmarks, in nightmares and whispered warnings, in the clink of metal against metal on dark, still nights when the veil between worlds grows thin. Listen carefully as you lie in bed tonight. That faint tapping at your window might just be branches in the wind, or it might be something else. Something wearing bronze rings on fingers long dead, coming to check if you bear the mark of Blackthorn in your blood, coming to collect what it believes is rightfully its own. Remember in those darkest moments to turn toward the light, toward faith, toward God and Jesus Christ, who offer protection against the shadows of the past and the horrors that linger beyond death's threshold. For while Eliza's bronze rings may bind the body, they cannot claim the soul that has found true salvation. Sleep well, if you can. And perhaps, before you close your eyes, check once more for that strange birthmark you never noticed before, the one shaped like a thorny branch slowly spreading across your skin.